Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Vulnerable and Underserved, Victim Services for Incarcerated Survivors of Sexual Abuse by Women. My name is Edward Cervantes, and I am Program Officer in JDI's LA office. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, which is made possible by a grant from the Office on Violence Against Women. JDI's mission, Just Detention International, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. JDI carries out its mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, by promoting public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and by supporting incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. JDI's core principle is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We have time at the end for questions, but please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar in the comment box, which is circled on the slide. This webinar will be recorded, and a recording will be posted on JDI's website in the coming weeks, along with a discussion guide with some resources. And before we begin, I also want to note self-care. Today's webinar will include discussions of some difficult and emotionally impactful topics, including personal accounts of sexual abuse in detention. Please keep your self-care in mind, and if you need to pause and step away from the webinar, please do so. Now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Cynthia Totten, who is in our Washington, D.C. office. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thanks, Edward, and thank you, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. So let's take a look at the objectives of today's webinar. The webinar aims to strengthen advocates' awareness of and capacity to provide services for incarcerated survivors where women are the perpetrators of this abuse. Contrary to popular perception, women are often the perpetrators of sexual abuse in detention. National inmate surveys by the Department of Justice have found that even though women make up only about a third of the corrections workforce, female staff commit more incidents of sexual violence than male staff. In male juvenile facilities, women commit a staggering 92% of instances of staff sexual misconduct. In addition, women prisoners face a far greater risk of sexual victimization by other prisoners than prisoners in male facilities do. These statistics and this topic is not easy to discuss. Broadly speaking, advocates and society in general has been accustomed to thinking of women as victims of abuse and men as perpetrators. Many people are surprised to hear that sexual abuse by women staff in particular is as big of a problem in detention settings as it is. Worse still are damaging tropes like that of men and adolescent boys, especially if they're locked up, who are eager for sexual contact with any woman, and of the female corrections officer who is manipulated into sex by male inmates and is thus seen as a victim instead of a perpetrator. Of course, victims of sexual abuse by women in the detention context include both men and women, but another key consideration is that men traditionally have not thought of victim services as being available to and for them. Many don't necessarily recognize what they have experienced as abuse, and they may feel even less deserving of victim services where the perpetrator is a woman. Additionally, not all, but many advocates have less experience working with male survivors than with women. We have long bought into the myth that a woman can't sexually assault a man or another woman, yet recent data suggests that sexual violence by women is likely substantially more prevalent in the community than previously understood. In the detention setting and the community, we're only just beginning to unravel what it all means and how to address it effectively. To help us get there, this webinar will explore the available information on the incidence and dynamics of sexual abuse in detention perpetrated by women. It will provide guidance for advocates on addressing the impact of this violence on survivors, including how to use the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards as a tool to advocate for prisoners' safety and for reports of abuse to be investigated. We'll also better understand the discomfort around this issue and why it's so important that every report of abuse be taken seriously, regardless of the perpetrator's gender. Our guest presenter will be an advocate who has provided individual in-person counseling for many incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse by women. A quick look at our roadmap for this conversation today. First, we'll look at the data on incidence and dynamics of sexual abuse in detention perpetrated by women. We'll then talk with an advocate who will provide guidance on some of the particular challenges to healing faced by these survivors. We'll also consider what the barriers are to reporting, why survivors of abuse by women in particular might be apprehensive about reporting, and what that means for an advocate's role. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Edward briefly to conduct an audience poll.
Thanks, Cynthia. Okay, so we'd like to hear from all of you. Please tell us whether or not you think your program staff are culturally competent to address the needs and concerns of incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by women. And the two answers are yes, we are fully prepared, and no, we need to strengthen our capacity. And I'll give you all a minute to respond. Or a little less than a minute. Okay, it looks like about 40% of you feel that your programs are ready and culturally competent, and about 60%, or 65 actually now, percent feel like you've got some work to do.
Okay.
And for those of you who said no, please use the questions box to the right, where we circled before, to tell us a little bit about why or what concerns you have about your readiness to provide culturally competent services for these survivors. So in the comments box, please enter, for those of you who answered no, if you could let us know why, or what concerns you have, rather. Okay, let's see. Okay, it says we don't have many of these cases. PREA and the facility do not always comply. There's actually barriers that don't allow people to speak with the clients. We have no programming specific to the issue. And that there's always more to learn. Okay, Cynthia, I'm going to turn things back over to you.
Great, thank you, Edward. So now let's turn to talking about the incidence and dynamics of sexual abuse in detention perpetrated by women. And thanks again for those responses to the poll. We'll definitely have those in mind as we go through the discussion today, and hope that definitely you'll walk away feeling like you've gotten a little bit of an answer and a little bit closer to where you want to be in terms of some of the cultural competency around these issues and this work. So as we'll discuss in the coming slides, most prisoners in the US are men, and thus most prisoners who have been victimized by women in the detention setting are men. But because men's prisons are hyper-masculinized environments, it can be especially difficult for male prisoners to report sexual abuse, and for the problem of sexual abuse by women in the detention setting to be surfaced. Male prisoners who report sexual abuse by women's staff may be afraid of ridicule by others if their victimization becomes public. They might fear that corrections officials will not believe them or will lack the competency to respond to these cases. Additionally, they may be concerned that staff perpetrators will turn the tables and accuse them of sexual assault. And let's pause before we jump into the data. I wanted to highlight or start by briefly sharing an incarcerated survivor's story. This survivor's name is Ivory. An officer sexually assaulted Ivory while he was serving time at a prison in Texas. The abuse started when she forcibly kissed him. Ivory reported this incident to a more senior staff person, but the abusive officer found out. She subsequently demanded that Ivory perform oral sex on her, threatening that if he didn't comply, she would accuse him of sexually assaulting her. A sergeant Ivory reported to told him that there was nothing that could be done because she was an officer and he was an inmate. The officer was charged with having improper sexual activity with a person in custody. However, this wasn't a consensual relationship and couldn't have been given the power differential. Ivory was transferred and given his only disciplinary ticket in 25 years of time served in retaliation for reporting. In this quote, he says, "Often people think that you deserve whatever happens to you in prison because you have committed a crime, but no one should be sexually assaulted by an officer. Inmates have no power to protect themselves, so we rely on the officers to make it a safe environment." So who are prisoners? More than 90% of all prisoners are male and 70% are men. And in using the term prisoners, 90% of all prisoners are male and about 7%, between 7 and 10% are women. And in using the term prisoners, I'm referring broadly to people who are incarcerated, not just in prison, but in a jail or community confinement or juvenile detention setting. And then moving into the incidence of sexual abuse in detention, according to an estimate by the lead researcher at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in U.S. prisons and jails each year. So to put this into perspective, this is approximately the population of Richmond, Virginia, a major U.S. city. Note that this figure represents the number of people who are sexually abused, not the number of incidents. Many of the 200,000 people who are sexually abused are abused more than once. And then looking at a broader array of facilities than just prisons and jails that were included in the prior data, according to a national survey of former state prisoners, 1 in 10 said they had experienced sexual abuse in their most recent incarceration in a state prison, local jail, or community confinement facility. And per the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about half of all sexual abuse in detention is committed by staff. So by staff, we're including security staff like corrections officers, as well as contractors like those who tend to work in food service, mental health, medical, maintenance, education, facility administration, and volunteers. So a fully kind of broad array of people who are performing some sort of responsibility within a detention setting. And though women make up only about 1/3 of corrections staff, they commit more than half of substantiated incidents of sexual abuse of inmates. They commit about 1/4 of all incidents of staff sexual harassment. Female staff most often victimize male inmates, so we're talking about abuse that is typically cross-gender in nature, and they victimize women inmates to a much lesser degree. And who's in juvenile detention settings? Well, there's about 55,000 youth who are held in facilities away from home as a result of juvenile or criminal justice involvement. Over 80% of these are male. According to a 2013 BJS study, Bureau of Justice Statistics, roughly 1 in 10 juvenile detainees reported that they had been victimized in the preceding 12 months. And of the 1 in 10 youth who reported that they were abused, about 80% reported that the abuser was a member of staff. And now again, and this is going specifically to the juvenile detention context, so even though only about 44% of all staff in state juvenile facilities are women, over 90% of staff sexual misconduct in juvenile facilities involved female staff, with male youth who were victimized. So again, in the vast majority of cases, males who are sexually assaulted in juvenile detention facilities are victimized by female staff. And here's a quick profile of female staff perpetrators of sexual abuse based on the data that we have. So female staff perpetrators of sexual abuse in detention commit more than 50% of incidents. They're often recent hires, especially in the juvenile context, and they're usually fairly young, under 30 years old. Female staff are less likely to commit sexual harassment, indecent exposure, voyeurism, and abusive searches than male staff are. However, the types of abuse that they commit often involves breaches in security, such as bribes, drugs, or alcohol. And as you've heard with Ivory, a common fact pattern is that female staff groom and coerce male prisoners into sexual relationships. If the inmate tries to break it off, they're threatened with loss of privileges or being accused of sexual assault. When victimized inmates report abuse, they're often written up. They might be put into segregation, they might be transferred to a different facility further from home. They might experience a loss of belongings, a loss of jobs within the facility, a loss of the good time that will help them get out of the facility earlier for good behavior, as well as a loss of visits. And often it's just not taken as seriously because the perpetrator is a woman. And you'll see here, this is a picture of Beverly, who is a woman, was in a woman's facility, and she was transferred to a maximum security prison far from her family after reporting sexual abuse by a female staff member. So as a fundamental point, as we talk about sexual abuse that's being committed by staff in prison, we want to be very clear that in no case is sexual contact between staff with inmates or residents permitted, right? In fact, it's against the law, it's a violation of PREA and the PREA standards. When it comes to sexual contact between inmates or residents, consensual contact does take place, of course. It's considered a facility rule violation, and thus it's not a matter of PREA, right? It's not a Prison Rape Elimination Act issue. It's a matter of a violation of facility rules. We want to emphasize that when we talk about consent, we're talking about an active, knowing, and enthusiastic yes, based on equal power, a choice that's not forced or coerced, and an ongoing process where either party is free to stop engaging in any activity at any moment. So we wanted to pause briefly and just talk a little bit about how you can use the PREA standards to advocate for your client's safety. So since most staff sexual abuse is cross-gender in nature, here are a few basics on cross-gender supervision that are helpful to have in mind. So in adult facilities, staff must not conduct cross-gender strip searches or cross-gender visual body cavity searches except in exigent circumstances or if it's being performed by medical practitioners. Security staff must be trained in how to conduct cross-gender pat searches in a professional and respectful manner, and in the least intrusive manner possible, consistent with security needs. And staff of the opposite gender must announce their presence when entering a housing unit. Thus, if a woman, a female staff, is entering a male housing unit, in order to avoid a situation where the male prisoners in that unit are being sort of viewed in states of undress for no good reason related to security purposes by staff of the opposite gender, that woman will have to announce woman on the unit, female on the unit, and that is something that if you're going into facilities, you should be seeing the women do when they're going into men's housing units, and vice versa if it's a man going into a woman's housing unit. Cross-gender pat searches of female inmates are not allowed in adult facilities except in exigent circumstances. And then it's also important to know that in the juvenile context, cross-gender pat searches, either of female or male residents, are not allowed. So let's look briefly at sexual abuse by women prisoners. So we're shifting from looking at sexual abuse by women staff to looking at sexual abuse committed by women prisoners, and keeping in mind what we just talked about with respect to what constitutes sexual abuse and what constitutes a question around, consent and sex between inmates, where there might be a question of whether there's been a rule violation or whether something was consensual. So we know that at least 6 in 10 women in state prisons have experienced physical or sexual abuse in their past, quite often before the age of 18. Women and girls in detention are 3 times more likely to be abused by other inmates or residents than by staff. And then what do we know about the dynamics of inmate-on-inmate abuse in women's facilities? So we know that informal family structures are common in women's facilities. The dynamics of familial abuse are often replicated, and love and friendship often mask abuse. Less violent or less visible abuse that goes on in these familial structures may be more easily disguised as consensual interactions. So the picture you see here of Chino is of Chino, who was sexually assaulted by an older woman inmate while serving time in a state prison. So women with histories of abuse may be less likely to recognize their victimization or to report it. And staff often fail to take seriously inmate-on-inmate sexual abuse in women's facilities. Officials often assume it's consensual, and meanwhile, in many cases, openly gay and bisexual women are wrongly presumed to be sexual predators. We wanted to share a story that demonstrates some of these dynamics. Sarah was raped by her cellmate and another inmate in a blind spot in the facility that she was housed in. She was targeted because she's bisexual. She did not report the abuse because she thought no one would believe that a gay or bisexual woman could be raped by 2 other females. And she says, whether you're straight, bisexual, gay, lesbian, transgender, whatever, it does not matter. Rape is still rape. If it happens behind these razor fences or not. It took a few years after I became an educator to share my story. Not only was I too terrified and too ashamed to tell anyone I was raped, especially since in my mind, who would believe a bisexual female was raped by another woman? I was a victim and did not like it. And so Sarah went on to become a peer educator in her facility, and that helped give her the strength to share her story and begin her healing process. So I wanted to highlight another aspect of the PREA standards that's important when thinking about inmate-on-inmate abuse. The standards require that every prisoner go through a risk screening that considers factors like whether the person experienced prior sexual victimization, whether the inmate's history is nonviolent, whether they have a mental, physical, or developmental disability, what their age is, and that inmate's own perception of their vulnerability. This is all intended to help ensure that inmates who are more vulnerable to sexual abuse are housed separately from those who are likely to be predatory. Okay, so let's now focus in on approaches to working with incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse perpetrated by women. Let's welcome Yolanda Ramirez, a therapist and I believe soon to be psychologist, I think, at Women's Center High Desert in Ridgecrest, California, which is an area that's surrounded by 4 mountain ranges. Good morning, Yolanda. Are you on the line?
Good morning. Yes, I am.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, and welcome to the webinar. Tell us about your work with incarcerated survivors.
I provide individual counseling for survivors, both men and women, at Lerdo Detention Facility in Kern County. I work with survivors of sexual assault, whether it happened during childhood or at any point in their life. And usually talking about child sexual abuse is often a good entry point for a lot of men. And my caseload right now consists of, I have about 15 people that I see at Lerdo.
Okay, that's great. So this is a sign-up sheet that people can use to ask for a meeting with you. But can you talk a little bit about the various ways in which prisoners can sign up to see you?
There are various ways. The screening takes place, some of the screening takes place probably at the point of entry during the assessment. And so that is one way that that they are flagged as possible PREA. And also, for example, the services over at Lerdo, if they have somebody who may be on suicide watch and they have mentioned something as to, or the red flags of sexual abuse, it gets routed in my direction. That's how I normally get to, that's how they come to me with this referral right here.
Okay. And then oftentimes, if something happens within the facility, staff may refer an inmate to you, and sometimes even another inmate may sort of tell one of their peers or friends about you, or suggest that someone come and see you, right?
Yes, that's another way that they also come to see me. Also, the chaplain, I have a good relationship with the chaplains there at the facility, and if somebody, the chaplain knows what I do, so if somebody tells him something about sexual abuse in their past, he will tell them that there's a lady that works here and this is what she does, and if they are okay with it, then he fills out the form as well and routes it my way. Mental health staff have also done that, and we also have a hotline that that an inmate can call and request services.
Okay, that's great. Okay, and here's a picture of the entrance to Kern County Jail, and that's where the Lerdo detention facility. So what made you decide to focus on providing individual therapy instead of group sessions?
I decided to do individual therapy just because it benefits the inmates a lot more, where they are able to disclose a lot more about their sexual abuse, as opposed to groups. You know, this is already a very hard subject for men to talk about, and when we have a large group and they are all sitting there and they know that I am PREA, you know, I don't ever want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. And if we did do groups, it would have to be something on the more psychoeducational side of that, and that would probably, I do want to consider doing groups in the near future for inmates who have already dealt with some of their trauma and are ready to sit in a group. But for right now, I really enjoy the benefits of individual sessions because it's confidential and they are able to disclose some pretty personal stuff that they have probably never told anybody.
Great. Now this is interesting. You told me that you have a facility ID that you're able to use to get into the facility more easily. Can you talk about how that came about? Because I know that a lot of advocates who are going into facilities to provide services do not have a facility ID, and talk about how this makes it easier for you.
Okay, I got the ID through the Sheriff's Department, and they actually, I filled out an application. They did a background check on me, so I had to go through the whole process with drug screening and the background check. And once I was cleared, I was given this badge right here. This badge actually makes it easy to move about the facility, but not always being escorted. And also the staff at the front desk, because Lerdo has 3 facilities, and the staff at the front desk, they know what I do, they know I'm PREA, they're familiar with me, and often provide me a confidential location to have my sessions with inmates.
And so when you go in, you're checking in with the facility's PREA office specifically?
Yes, in the mornings, what I do, I check in with the PREA office. At that point is when I am given any new referrals that might have came through overnight, or somebody who has requested some sort of services. And then that's when I sit down and I make my list of the people that I'm going to see for the day. And then I'm on my way to the different facilities to see the inmates.
Okay, great. So the facility, those PREA officers are the only ones who actually know who you're there to see?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And so speaking of confidentiality then, how do you handle confidentiality? What are the other sort of key elements to that for you?
For confidentiality, when I ask to see somebody, it's always going to be in the attorney booths. And I have asked staff to bring one person at a time, because at Lerdo there are like multiple booths. I never want the inmates sitting in the different booths waiting for me. So they bring one out at a time. And when they are told that they have a visit, I'm referred to as a professional visit. They don't ever say PREA, so a lot of times the other inmates will assume, you know, that they are here to see their lawyer.
Okay. And so then you said that the sessions occur in an attorney booth. Can you describe a little bit of what that setup is?
The attorney booths are confidential. They don't record any of the conversations that are taking place. You know, I'm not necessarily in the back where all the inmates see me walk through. I wait for them at the attorney booths, and it's really safe as well. You know, they always have a staff person who maintains the visual surveillance upon the booths. And again, confidential. That is really important for the people that we see.
Okay, great. And then in terms of safety, is there like a staff person who's sort of maintaining visual surveillance where you are? Are you separated from your client? Are you physically? How does that work?
Yes, the attorney booths are separated with plexiglass or the mesh between us. So I never have direct contact with them where I can touch them. And yes, there's always a guard at the tower, a staff member who maintains a visual on the attorney booths.
Okay. And one of the things that I really like about hearing all of this is that having your visits, it sounds to me like having them treated like an attorney visit also adds just an air of sort of professionalism and a sense of like, you know, it's a foregone conclusion, this is going to be confidential, and there's sort of a level of respect for you and your purpose there at the facility, as opposed to feeling like you're having staff sort of wondering what you're doing or questioning why you're there or doubting, you know, sort of your impact.
Yes, or trying to figure out where they're going to sit me so that I can meet with the inmate. No, that doesn't happen. They know that it's the attorney booths, and yes, there is a level of respect for what I am doing.
That's great. Okay, and here's a picture of signage that is up in the day room at the facility, and this is intended to inform prisoners about the availability of your hotline, as well as their right, you know, the right to be free from sexual abuse. One thing that I noticed when I saw this poster is that even though your hotline is there, there is no mention specifically of Women's Center High Desert. So I wanted to just ask, was it hard to get all of this into place? Did you have any input into the signage, or, you know, what was the decision behind not including the name Women's Center High Desert in it?
It was something that we worked with the compliance officers to come up with, you know, and confidentiality, protecting their confidentiality. That's why you will see that written on this flyer, because that is very important to them. A lot of people have not ever shared what has happened to them. And working with staff of the facility and them understanding the importance of these sessions and the confidentiality and where they are supposed to be held in, which is the attorney booths again.
And I imagine that by not including Women's Center High Desert on the poster makes it sort of removes one of the sort of obstacles that often come up when you're working specifically with male prisoners. You know, a lot of men won't really feel like something is intended for them, or like it's something that they should take advantage of if, for example, they see, you know, the term women or the term, you know, rape or something. If it's kept a bit more open, they're a little bit more likely to take advantage of that. Have you found that to be the case?
That is the case, because if, you write anything of women on there, you're absolutely right, or a crisis center, that will deter them possibly from getting the help that they need.
Yeah, okay. So how many visits are you able to have? Has the facility attempted at all to put a limit on how many times you can meet confidentially with a client?
PREA doesn't state how many times we are to see a client. Therefore, I will see a client depending on what I think is appropriate or what their needs are, as many times as I need to see them. And I have seen clients up to twice a week until, we deal with some of the harder stuff. If they've just disclosed something for the very first time, I will see them up to twice a week. And
Okay.
normally I will see them until they are released about once a week.
And so that could be more than 10 visits, or what do you think is maybe average?
It's different for everybody because it is a detention center.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have people that have been there for quite a while, and then we have those who I may meet with them maybe twice, and then they are released or sentenced and they go off to prison. So it just depends on the individual's needs as well.
Okay. And do you consult with the staff, the facility mental health staff, or the PREA coordinator in making your decisions, or are these decisions completely up to your discretion?
No, I have very good communication with the PREA officer. So when I started to see people, that was part of the information that I got. I said, how many times can I see somebody? And so I was told that that PREA doesn't state the number of times I can see a client. So it's up to me.
That's great. Okay, so here's that same signage in Spanish, and of course we know it's really important to have this type of information available, not only in Spanish, but depending on what part of the country you're in and what the predominant languages are that are spoken in that community. It's really important to have your posters up in all of the necessary languages. We worked with a jail in Miami that included, in addition to English and Spanish, Haitian Creole, and they had all of the information for inmates available in Haitian Creole to ensure, given that the location in the country, that the information was accessible to as many inmates as possible. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about what it's like to work with prisoners who are survivors of sexual abuse by women. How does this issue surface in the work that you're doing?
I find that this issue surfaces in the same way it would as anybody being who has gone through this type of trauma. I see similar symptoms such as anxiety, depression, trouble with relationships, poor coping skills, PTSD. So the level of trauma for men who had been perpetrated by women is similar to those of any type of trauma as if they were perpetrated by a man.
And then in the work that you're doing, you really put out the issue and the availability that you have to work with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Do you find that that's an issue that surfaces often with the men in the facility?
I do find that this issue surfaces, and I believe it may be, because of the time that they have, and then they see these posters up throughout the facility, and this is an issue that arises when they find themselves, in jail, and that's when, a lot of them will take the opportunity to see what these services are about.
Okay. And in a lot of the cases of childhood sexual abuse that you see, are the perpetrators women in many of the cases, or what sorts of patterns do you see?
Yes, I do see that it's a lot of women who are perpetrators. Also, when the perpetrator is looking for a victim, I know that we often think about perpetrators being the men. However, working with the population that I've been working with, I would say that it's equal across the board. We have as many men perpetrated by women as there are men who perpetrate on men and women.
Okay. Okay. And then you talked a little bit about the fact that the men get to the facility and they've never been able to talk about these issues before. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that. I mean, I would think that in particular, when you're talking about an incarcerated population, you're talking about lots of people who have been marginalized or who, you know, have not had the same level of access or even the same messaging that this type of service is available to them as you or I might have. And so I wonder if you can, you know, just talk a little bit about the fact that people probably get to the facility and this is that first opportunity to kind of, you know, talk about and just talk openly about some of the trauma that they've experienced.
Yes, I have found that, you know, a lot of these men are talking about this for the very first time in their lives. You know, being a male, I mean, we often see statistics that they report that women often are more depressed than men. That's actually a false statistic because women just report it more often. I mean, I would believe that it's the same with sexual abuse. You know, men don't report it as often as a woman would or talk about it. So when they go to this facility and they, like I said, they see these flyers around and they know that this is something that's happened in their life, you know, that's when they do start requesting some of our services and it becomes something that's easier for them to talk about. Just the access to somebody who is willing to listen.
Yeah, that's great. That's so important. And this is a picture of the prison in California City, California. So you have a Spanish-speaking client at this facility, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So so I guess what happened with this one is you have a colleague who has a caseload at this facility, but she doesn't speak Spanish. So essentially what you all figured out is that you would go here to work with this one client,
Yes.
but otherwise you work at Lerdo and she works here at California City.
Yes, and I do travel to go meet with him.
Okay, great. So what's your approach? I mean, how do you, when you think specifically, you know, wanting to give advocates who are listening as much guidance as we can around working with survivors of sexual abuse by women, how do you try to work with the clients who you're talking to? What are your particular approaches when it comes to unpacking the trauma and everything related to abuse by women?
I start with normally what I already know about trauma and sexual abuse and the shame, embarrassment, and guilt that people tend to carry with them after an act, you know, that of some sort that has happened to them. So my approach is usually I start off with letting them know that, you know, rape is something that nobody ever asked for, and that it's not their fault. And I try to separate that shame and embarrassment and guilt that it's not theirs to carry. That's how I normally start. That's how the approach I normally start with is trying to separate that guilt, embarrassment, and shame that they carry.
That sounds great. And give me a sense of what you see. What's the typical profile of the men that you're talking with in respect to these past histories of sexual abuse?
I'll give you an example. I worked with an inmate who was, he was about 11 or 12 years old when his mother would bring in a lot of female friends on the weekends after a night of partying. And one of those female friends of the mother would go in and molest this child at 11 or 12 years old. Up to this day, he has difficulty with relationships. And he has a lot of anxiety around a relationship with a female. And it often, you know, like in his case, when he tried to talk about it when he was 11 or 12 years old, You know, when he tried to tell his father's response was, great, you got laid. So this child was invalidated for how he was feeling instead of being able to talk to somebody about what he went through and work through that trauma.
Yeah.
So I often, go ahead.
No, sorry, please finish your point.
Yeah, so this is what I often see is a lot of young men who had been abused by a woman who was older, often mom's friend or an older girl when they were just a child.
Yeah. And that has to make it incredibly tough, because what you're dealing with then is a survivor who in some cases may not recognize what they went through as abuse. And so then part of the work that you're doing, which, you know, for some advocates may feel almost a bit counterintuitive, is kind of disrupting some of what that person has been holding on to all of this time, maybe in order to cope or in order to sort of survive. They've looked at that abuse as like, no, that was consensual, or that was something that I had to do, or that was a bad choice that I had to make under the circumstances. And part of what you're doing is coming in and saying, no, that wasn't a choice. You weren't in a position to make a choice. Is that difficult sometimes? Do people sometimes have to stand back and kind of feel the weight of like, wow, this is abuse?
You know what, that has happened plenty of times as well, where I'll get a young man and he will say, you know, he was 12 in a relationship with a 35-year-old woman. And so taking a step back, you know, I would remind him that wasn't a relationship. However, in order to cope with what he's gone through, that's what he has kind of said to himself throughout the years, not recognizing the effects that that had as well, you know, because a child of that age, he is not ready for that type of physical stimulation or emotional stimulation at that young of an age, you know, and so there are going to be effects to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a collage of survivors of sexual abuse. Some are formerly incarcerated, some are currently incarcerated. These are all people who have written to JDI. So Yolanda, can you talk a little bit more about what you see in the survivors you work with who were assaulted by women? So we know that male survivors face social and cultural barriers, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but when talking about sexual abuse, male survivors face a lot of these barriers. And this is especially true in men's institutions, where this sort of hyper-masculinity, toxic masculinity, you know, misogyny is the norm, and it's almost an imperative for safety in some sense. Men, particularly men of color, who are the majority of people who are locked up, have often been groomed to be sort of tough since childhood. They're supposed to be able to use physical power and intimidation to end any unwanted sexual encounter. And if they're still abused, they're not supposed to be emotionally impacted by it. If they seek help, they may not relate to terms like victim or rape. They may be reluctant to, as we talked about before, seek help from an organization that has woman or rape in the title. And even for those who want to seek help, there's the real danger of being seen as weak and especially in this type of environment, subjected to further abuse as a result, not to mention retaliation. How do you do your work in the midst of all of those barriers and obstacles?
Well, I do find that the male survivors of this abuse, the trauma and confusion seem especially acute. They have never been able to deal with what they went through. Their emotions are quite raw, and many of them, what we do see in the male is a lot of anger, because they don't know how to deal with what they have gone through and the feelings that they have, you know, and also the way that they have coped is almost, you know, looking at the sexual abuse that they experienced by women during childhood as a rite of passage, or, you know, or something that they were just supposed to do, a relationship, and they don't quite understand the many difficulties that they experience emotionally. And like you said earlier, you know, they will often try to say, okay, well, that was consensual, and that was consensual, and they often, but yet they still have all of this emotional turmoil going on inside.
Yeah. So I guess, part of your work is trying to kind of help them to understand how this is affecting them now, right? How to unpack some of that so that they can start to just dig through it and move forward to some healthier place.
Yes, for example, if, the majority of the clients that are in jail, they are in there because they're impulsive, or their anger has got the best of them and they have committed a crime. When we look at anger, I try to show them what's underneath all of this anger, and what we often find is that there's hurt, there's betrayal, they have all these underlying emotions that they have never quite dealt with. So my approach is to help them deal with some of those emotions underneath all of that anger, in hopes that some of that anger would start to, go lessen, and also providing coping skills for them.
And do you have some clients who were sexually abused by women who work at either the current facility or another facility that they've been at? Do you see some of those cases of sexual abuse by women staff?
You know what? I have heard of some of those issues, and they are very reluctant to report those because they don't think anybody will take them seriously.
Yeah. And so the facilities that you're working with now, are they good when it comes to handling sexual abuse reports?
You know what? I think they are very good. When there's been a PREA report, they are very good about handing that over to us, and doing an interview with the inmates and the investigators. They will, what they do is, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little mixed up here.
Okay.
But overall, they do very good, and the investigators conduct their interviews of the sexual abuse survivors. And what we often do is, because there's so much frustration because of this, what I like to do is I like to ask the officers if I can have a minute with them before they interview, and I prepare the clients as to how this interview is going to take place. I let them know that the officers are going to ask many questions. They are fact finders, and I tell them not to get frustrated, answer the questions as best as possible, because what we don't want is them getting upset or feel like they're not being believed. So I let them know in advance what their job is, and that way, because if they get frustrated, what do we get at the end? And then, uncooperative, inconclusive, or something of that nature when the clients get frustrated and don't want to talk anymore.
So what do you think causes that frustration? Is it that the investigators don't fully understand how trauma works? We know that survivors of sexual abuse are likely to talk about their abuse in a fragmented, non-linear manner. And so for an untrained investigator, that can come across as lacking credibility. Is that part of what you're trying to, sort of deal with? Yes.
When somebody is trying to talk about their trauma, it does come up and, kind of scattered. So therefore, I do find that the officers who are investigating don't understand trauma, and that's probably how they're going to get the story. And there's going to be missing parts of it, and they're not always going to remember everything that has happened. So that is an issue that we deal with.
Yeah. And do you think that your services are making a difference in the facility?
I do believe my services are making a huge difference there. A lot of people are very thankful, for the ability that we provide a safe place for them to talk about this. And one of the biggest compliments that I have gotten is that, people, that we care, that we go in and we actually care, we listen to them. For the very first time, people are disclosing some of this stuff, and to get that validation of how they feel is very, very important, and what they've gone through and the feelings that they have inside, that's super important for them. Yeah, and I remember one thing you shared with me that really impacted me is the fact that
I think these folks really appreciate having a 50-minute session, right? Because a lot of times when mental health comes by to do a check-in, it's 5 minutes because mental health staff in a facility are so overwhelmed with all the work that they have to do. But to have an opportunity to sit down with you for 50 minutes is kind of game-changing.
It is. They really appreciate the time that I take with them and the consistency. You know, if I tell them I'm going to be back in a week, you know, that's what I need to do my best to do for them. So that's very important because it is true. The staff there at the facility, they're overwhelmed and they come in, are you doing okay? You're not feeling suicidal? They ask these questions, you know, because they have to and really don't spend too much time with them. And they know how to answer these questions.
Mm-hmm. So what other advice, sort of, you know, closing up, what advice do you have aside from this for advocates?
Part of the thing that a lot of these the clients are worried about is being judged, you know, when you sit down with them. So I never ask anything about their crime. A lot of times they will disclose it. And you know, I am not there to judge them. I am there to help them get through their past sexual abuse and the things that they have done to get them to where they are today, or possibly the way they have lived their life. So it is really important, you know, to check your biases at the door. People who are incarcerated have really good survival skills, you know, and if you come in there and you are judgmental or you are not real, they can sense that right away.
Wow. That's really a tremendous advice, Yolanda. Thank you so much for joining us, and please do stay on so that the audience can ask you some questions in a few minutes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So before we move into the Q&A session, I wanted to sort of close out with a quick look at how an incarcerated survivor decides whether to report abuse, what considerations they might take into consideration, what might be first and foremost on their mind. These may be issues that you'll want to help your clients work through in your counseling. So why don't survivors tell? Incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse face most of the same barriers to reporting or seeking help as survivors in the community. According to a recent Bureau of Justice Statistics study, many incarcerated survivors didn't want anyone to know about the assault due to feelings of embarrassment or shame. And also according to the BJS, survivors may also keep quiet out of a fear of punishment, like isolation, including placement in solitary confinement, or as I mentioned earlier, the loss of good time or the loss of programming opportunities. There's also the ever-present fear of retaliation and re-victimization by the perpetrator or friends of the perpetrator, or by others as a result of being labeled a snitch. Finally, survivors may not speak out for reasons like fearing that their report will not be kept confidential, having little trust in staff to properly handle and investigate the report, not knowing that the inmate themselves may not know how to make a report. They may not know how to make a report to someone outside the facility, which may feel safer for them. They may not recognize what has happened to them as meeting the definition of abuse, as Yolanda and I just discussed. And they may also fear being blamed for the abuse. So while that can happen to any incarcerated survivor, that can be particularly common for the inmates who are the most vulnerable, such as LGBT inmates or other inmates who are seen as less able to defend themselves, you know, may be blamed as being sort of somehow responsible for the sexual abuse, when of course nothing could be further from the truth. And just as an example of the types of dynamics that might make a victimized inmate fearful of reporting sexual abuse by a female staff member, I wanted to share Justin's story. So the perpetrator and 2 other staff members were fired as a result of the investigation that took place here. But what happened is Justin reported that a female staff member sexually assaulted him. And after investigating, the sheriff told him that the case would not go forward because I am a male prisoner, Justin said, being sexually assaulted by a female staff member. So again and again, you see this tendency to say, this is not something that anything is going to be done about. You're a prisoner, you're a man, and the person that you're accusing is a female and a staff member. Fortunately, in this case, the perpetrator and 2 other members, as I said, were fired once the investigation took place, but the state unfortunately declined to prosecute, as happens in so many cases. So what we see from the data is that all of the fears that prisoners share about why they did not report end up making a lot of sense. They bear out in the data. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics has found that when it comes to abuse by staff, in 46% of cases where an inmate is reporting sexual abuse by staff, the victim is written up. In 40%, 41%, they're moved into restrictive housing or solitary confinement. And in 15%, there's no facility response at all. When it comes to reports of abuse by other inmates, similarly, you have 29% of cases the victim is written up, 34% they're moved into restrictive housing, and even a much higher percentage than in the case of staff abuse, no facility response in 37% of cases. And we wanted to close out with just sharing again some of what survivors are hearing. So again, the basis for all of these fears are evidenced not just by the data, but by the many things that survivors tell JDI that they hear when they do report abuse, right? So for every survivor who's incarcerated, who has that courage and bravery to stand up and say, something happened to me and I need help. They come to JDI after making that report and say, yes, I made a report, but look what happened, look what I was told. JDI receives about 2,000 letters and over 50 calls a month from survivors of sexual abuse in detention. And these are some of the real life responses that survivors have received when disclosing sexual abuse. So a victim's own father said, how could you let yourself get raped by a guard? What kind of man are you? A facility nurse told one survivor, your medical kite said that you're coming down for chest pains. So you're basically telling me that you lied about a life-threatening medical condition. I'm going to need to speak to an officer about this. An investigator said to one survivor, we reviewed the videotape from that night and we didn't see an officer raping you. We know you're lying. If you don't retract your statement, we'll charge you with making a false report. A survivor's cellmate told them, are you for real? I can't hang out with no punk. Don't say nothing about that to me again, bro. And this is what a correctional officer suggested, or correctional counselor. I can see from your file that you've had issues with staff at other institutions. Perhaps you'd be better off in ADSEG or solitary confinement so that we can keep a closer eye on you. So it's no surprise why victims of sexual abuse in detention do not report. Ultimately, they need people who will take their reports seriously, advocates who will believe them and work with them, and they need people who will be there to support them and provide that assistance that we all have a right to. So let's move into a bit of time now for Q&A. Edward, do we have any questions that have come in at all?
Yep. We have a question for Yolanda. It says, hi, I'm a therapist with a crisis center. I was wondering if the counseling services offered are paid by the correctional facility or are you contract? We are trying to work out a plan to make these services available for inmates in San Antonio, Texas.
The services I provide, I believe we have a contract with the Laredo facility. I work for a rape crisis center and that's how I get my money.
Okay, yeah, so I believe that there's a contract between
Yes.
Women's Center High Desert and that facility. And then you also, I believe, some of your work is supported by the state OVW or OVC funding as well, because there was a solicitation that was put out from the California Office on Emergency Services to provide support for, or to provide funding for a dedicated advocate at rape crisis centers who would work solely and focus solely on sexual abuse in detention settings. And so that's your role, I guess, Yolanda, right? I mean, I think there are a couple of you at Women's Center High Desert who provide quite a lot of, spend quite a lot of your time working with incarcerated survivors.
Yes.
Great.
I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we have another question. This one is for you, Cynthia. While I acknowledge that we certainly don't see the true numbers of male survivors or female perpetrators, I am struggling with the idea that women are the majority of perpetrators in incarcerated environments. Can you talk about why those numbers could be so different from the traditional statistics that we know about sexual violence?
Well, I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a need for proper training and proper screening, and that is really what the standards, the PREA standards, try to address. Is the need to basically, when you're looking at who your staff are and who you're bringing on into your facility to fill these roles, whether security or any other role in a facility, that you have to do the proper screening, and that once you have staff on board, what we see again and again at JDI is a couple things. One is the failure to provide serious training on an ongoing basis, right? Training isn't just something that happens at the academy. It has to happen every year. It has to happen regularly, and not just every year, but on an ongoing basis. The other problem that we see is the culture of a lot of facilities, where, again, the absolute responsibility of staff to protect the inmates in their care, or to protect the residents in their care in the juvenile context, and to not engage in behavior that is either abusive, sexually abusive, or sexually harassing, that responsibility is not taken with the seriousness that it demands. And so when you look at failures around culture, staffing, training, and also having an environment where, as a staff person, if you see that there is a problem, if you see that you may be in a situation where you are going down a slippery slope, or you have crossed some boundaries that are sort of not in keeping with the professional boundaries that you need to maintain with the people in your custody, you need to be able to have a place to go, or an environment in which that can be addressed, as opposed to just hidden, or opposed to just having an environment where staff are just kind of keeping that under wraps. And so all of those things, I think, contribute to this problem. So there's a lot more to say about it, but I think that sort of gets at some of it.
Okay, we have one more question. Are there any PREA materials that have been made age appropriate for youth facilities? If so, can they be shared on a resource sharing project or JDI's page?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have PREA refreshers that are available for the juvenile context. And you can actually find those on the PREA Resource Center's website. Those are PREA refreshers that are specifically for juvenile facilities, and can be adapted a little bit for your specific facility or facility that you're providing services at, and that sort of address some of the major issues that come up, such as boundaries, communication, privacy, investigations, etc. And the facility can create additional ones based on their needs. So. Great. Any other questions? We've still got a bit more time. Yolanda, was there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I think we covered a lot.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me just move on here and mention the next webinar in this series. We've got 2 more. The next one is focusing on incarcerated deaf and hard of hearing survivors, and that's going to be on June 6th, which is next week. Actually, I think that's supposed to be, I think I made a mistake there. It says Wednesday, June 6th, but I believe it is Thursday, June 6th, so that is my mistake. So Thursday, June 6th, we will have this webinar at 2 to 3:30 Eastern, and you can register on the link that you see here on the screen. And then there's more information available on JDI's Advocate Resources page. There's tons of resources there. If you have additional questions, please do write to us at advocate@justdetention.org, or go to our website at justdetention, www.justdetention.org, and there's our Facebook and Twitter information as well. And then please do pause before jumping off the line and fill out this survey. You'll see a link to it here to help us ensure that that we're providing information that's useful for all of you. Great, and so I think you were probably supposed to say some of that, Edward. I'll turn back over to you to close out.
No, I'm done.
Great.
That's it.
Okay, thanks everyone so much for tuning in, and thank you so much, Yolanda.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.